Hey Bible Explorers, we're getting ready to go into another week of journeying through the Bible together, and I've been reminded of two things as we've been doing that. The first, that I love this book. This book has helped me and challenged me in so many ways. I especially love the smell of this book. But I've also been reminded that if I'm honest with myself, the Bible can be difficult and tricky to read sometimes. If you remember, that's the whole reason I started doing these videos and the whole reason I started the small group that I'm doing. So, as I've been reading Genesis, I've been reminded of all these really wonderful stories that have a lot to teach us about God and creation and humanity and all of our relationship to each other and its purpose and its meaning. There's a lot to remember, a lot to learn, a lot to gain from delving into these stories. But I also have been reminded that this book is an ancient book by ancient authors from ancient times. And if I, today, as Jeremy Brewer in East Texas in the 21st century, am going to understand what this book is really trying to teach me about God and myself and the world, then I'm going to have to take myself out of 21st century Texas and try and put myself back in the culture and the context of the times and the people that wrote this book. So to help you do the same thing, because I want all of us to be better students and better readers of the Bible, I'm going to give you some basic tips. Not going to go into depth here. I'm just going to introduce you to some ideas and concepts, and I'll help you with some resources at the end to show you how you can be a better student of the Bible. First, I want to give you a few things to remember about the context and the culture of the Bible. I want you to remember and understand they have a very specific understanding of the cosmos, and it's very different than ours. When we think about the Earth and the universe, we think about our planet with other planets in a solar system and galaxies that go and go and go on for infinity and make up the universe. And it's mind-boggling and beautiful to try and comprehend. The Bible, folks, had no idea about outer space. There was their world, and it consisted of three things: the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. So they had a very particular understanding of the cosmos. And it's interesting to note that nowhere in Scripture does God correct them or say, wait a second, you need to understand quantum physics and black holes and gravity. God doesn't come down and reveal that to them. So when we're reading these stories in the Old Testament, and we hear about the sun and the moon and the stars and the way they're fixed in the sky, or that the earth stands on pillars of creation, all of those different things, if the point was for us to understand where it all came from, God would have revealed that and explained it to these original authors and this original audience. But he didn't. There was something else going on. So we have to remember that. Also, keep in mind, these people from thousands of years ago, there was no division between the natural world and the spiritual world. It was all mixed in together in one whole reality. They didn't go outside and say, I'm going to study the natural world today and perform experiments on this grass and measure the barometric pressure. And then on Sunday, I'm going to go deal with my spiritual life at church. Everything was spiritual. Everything was physical. It was all together mixed in, especially in the Old Testament. We're just going to see earth and the people in it and how they understood it. Like God, for example, they very much understood and believed that God was moving and acting in the world, in his creation, that he was thoroughly involved. The authors were writing in their understanding and their context. They believed that physical and spiritual were one reality, and that God and the other gods were very much involved in that reality. A really big thing that we need to remember when we read these stories is that these ancient Eastern cultures were also these ancient that is a mouthful. These ancient Eastern cultures were very much patriarchal cultures. The dad was the man. He was in charge. He had all the legal power. He could sell property. He could own property. He could legally negotiate. He could have an inheritance. He could bestow an inheritance. He could negotiate the bride price for a bride. He could sell his daughters as brides to others. They negotiated treaties. They declared war. Legal power belonged to the men. But you will also see that just because women couldn't hold legal authority and position didn't mean that they were powerless and without influence. Many stories in the Bible show women still having power and influence by working in and through their relationships. So watch for those when they come up in the story. Now, there were some tips, things to look for and remember when we were reading context. You don't want to take things out of context. You don't want to try and make sense of Abraham's story by assuming that Abraham is a guy that lives down the street from you. You have to remember his context, his world, to understand his story. Here are some literary tips, things that when you are reading the Bible and the stories in it, they should catch your attention to say, oh, there's something going on here the author wants me to notice. The first is repetition, the repeating of things, when things get repeated. When you hear or see repetition in a story, the author is either trying to make you remember this, or he's trying to draw attention to it, or he wants to emphasize it. Repetition was absolutely a tool for emphasizing something in a biblical narrative. So when you see repetition, pay attention to it, notice it, recognize it's there for a reason. Next, you want to watch for patterns. This is especially true if you want to see what's going on in the larger story and narrative. For example, I can read the story of Abraham and say, oh, cool story, and then read the story of Isaac and say, oh, cool story. But if I'm a careful reader, I might notice that there are patterns, things that Abraham does, that then Isaac does, that then his son Jacob does. And it shows me that the author wants me to see there's something larger at play in the story than just Abraham's life, Isaac's life, or Jacob's life. Watch for the breaking of patterns. If you see a pattern, especially an obvious one, and then it's suddenly broken, that's important. There's something to learn here. Pay attention to names, the naming of things or people, and when people's names change. In this ancient Eastern world and culture, names had power. Names had meaning. They spoke almost prophetically over somebody's life, but they also commemorated things. And when we see naming happening in the story, it's telling us something a little bit deeper or showing us just how important something is that's going on there. It's especially significant when somebody's name changes. And because it's a patriarchal world, it's usually men that are naming things. Adam names the animals and names Eve. And then Abraham names his sons, and etc., etc. And this person names their sons, and this person names their son. But all of a sudden you might see where, oh, this woman named somebody. All of a sudden the pattern is broken, and naming is important. What's going on there? Look at it a little bit closer. Finally, something to really watch for in the stories is when there are blessings or there are curses. In the ancient Eastern world, words had power to take on life and create and shape reality. In the beginning, God spoke creation into existence. So when people would speak blessings, it mattered. A blessing or a curse, those words, the idea would almost be like they would hover in the air until they came into being in reality and existence. Because again, there was no difference between the spiritual and the physical. It was all the same reality. So when they speak blessings or curses, pay attention, because it's literally a shaping of reality and is probably directing us to something in the story or something that's coming in the story. So there you have it. Just a few quick tips and tricks and things to pay attention to help you understand A, the culture and the context of what you're reading, but also B, literary tools and tips that should grab your attention and let you know something here deserves my attention a little bit more. Watch for those things, be mindful of them. Now, these are just bullet points, just introductions, but there are great tools and resources out there to help you go deeper and be a better student of the Bible. Here are a couple of those resources. The first is simple, just a really good study Bible. This one, for example, is the Cultural Background Study Bible. And this Bible does a really good job of exploring ancient themes, customs, geography, archaeology, stuff that it teaches us about what's going on in the biblical story. Another resource is a good commentary. You can never go wrong investing in a decent commentary. One of the best places to start, I think, especially if you're on a budget, is with the InterVarsity Press Bible Background Commentary. This comes in an Old Testament and a New Testament, and each one is only like $28-30 on Amazon. These are really good about looking at the cultural context, the history, things that are going on in the text that will help you to understand that world in that context better. Another great tool is simply getting an introductory book to the Old Testament or the New Testament. They're usually called Introduction to the Hebrew Bible or Introduction to the Old Testament or Old Testament Survey. Again, you can find these online. They're really affordable, and they're great to just read one chapter at a time. Each chapter usually looks at a single book. It'll help you to understand the context, the history, the background, the culture, the society, what's going on in there. You can read this and then dive into the book that you're going to read or study in the Bible, and it'll really help fill out your understanding. And finally, there's good old-fashioned books. Once you get to this level, you're usually focusing in more on singular topics. This one, for example, The Lost World of Genesis 1, is a more in-depth look at the creation story and how we actually understand that with what the biblical writers were trying to say and how they said it, and compare that to what we as modern readers are often trying to get out of the creation story that maybe they didn't intend. You know, we get in fights about, is it a new earth, an old earth? Did creation happen 6 literal days, or did it happen over millions and millions of years? And this author, for example, would argue, if we're asking those questions, we're asking questions that the author never intended to address to begin with, because the author was concerned with something completely different in the creation story. So you can always get into individual books like this, and at the end of the day, read your Bible again and again and again, and read it in community with others. The Bible is best explored in community with each other. So whatever you do, wherever you start with the Bible itself and read it together. Grace and peace.